Alrighty then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 128. I am your host, pannobhasa. And for those of you who are not good at numbers, 128 is kind of a high number. And I got my beverage here with the classy little paper umbrella. Take a sip of said beverage. And before I start answering questions, I would like to indulge in a little fantasy fulfillment. I hope you will indulge me in this indulgence. There's always this way I wanted to start a Dhamma talk back when I was a monk. And it doesn't work in Asia. I mean, you can't really tell jokes in Asia very easily if you're a foreign monk, partly because the Burmese kind of, how do I put it? They're always willing to think the best of somebody in a way. So if you say something absurd, they'll think, well, he's just a foreigner. You know, he hasn't fully mastered our language. So he's trying to say something else and it's just coming out accidentally this way. And another thing is the Burmese, like Buddhist Asians in general, want to take monks very seriously. So if you're a Burmese monk, you can tell jokes, they'll laugh because they know you've mastered the language and everything. But if you're a foreign monk and you tell a joke, it usually bombs, or it often bombs, because, you know, they don't know whether you really meant to say that and they want to take you seriously and all this. So I used to have this fantasy when I was still a monk of sitting down. It'd have to be in front of a Western audience, you know. They're all like waiting for the profound wisdom to emerge, you know. I come and sit down in my robes, and then I'll say something like, don't you hate it when you feel like you really have to take a dump, and then you go in and you strain and all that comes out are like 5 or 6 little nuggets? Don't you hate that? And what's even worse than that is when, like, the turd pinches off halfway, and then the what's left, it won't come out and it won't go back in either. So you wind up having to wipe like 30 times. Don't you hate that? And I always wanted to start a Dhamma talk that way, and just could never really bring myself to do it. And so now I have subjected you to it. And so I'm just going to start answering questions. Enough of this foolishness. The first question is from Siovakchin Sipad Zidana, who didn't make it, didn't ask his first question in time, but he asked it like after I'd already recorded the last one. So he's at the top of the list this time. And he says, in the uncarved marble block analogy, why would a carved block be dukkha or samsara, but not an uncarved block, which would be nibbana? And the reason why you take the nameless uncarved block, which is not dukkha, and you make like imaginary statues out of it, like virtual statues, why that is dukkha is partly because to imagine and then believe this virtual statue carved out of the nameless uncarved block requires will. It requires effort, which is driven by a kind of restless dissatisfaction. And to believe in it requires delusion. And delusion carries its own kind of dukkha. So it requires effort, which is impelled by this restless dissatisfaction that is pushing us through samsara from one moment to the next. And also, it's just pervaded by delusion because you are believing that this imaginary statue, which is really potentially in there, in that uncarved block, but to believe that that is the statue and that it's real and everything, that's a delusion, and that's got its own kind of dukkha accompanying it. So I'm just going to move on to Siovakchin Sipad Zidana's next question, which is, based on the Ashokan inscriptions, did the language written in Magadha or Lumbini use terminology similar to the Pali version of words or Sanskrit? For example, did the languages seem to use words like kama versus karma, siddhartha versus siddhata, etc.? I'm curious whether the particularities of Pali are also found in the Buddha's native tongue, or if those things were a particularity of the languages spoken in more Western regions where Pali seems to be closest to. Well, I'm no authority on Ashokan inscriptions, but I do know that the word Dhamma is spelled Dhamma in the inscriptions. So it's not Dharma, it's Dhamma even in the Ashokan inscriptions. And the theory is that the Buddha spoke Magadhi. It would be like a few hundred years older than the Ashokan inscriptions, and changes can occur in a language over a few hundred years. Just consider like Shakespeare with us, or even like a novel written in like the 19th century compared to like language now, English language now. There's going to be noticeable differences. But the language of Magadha or Magadhi, which the Buddha presumably spoke, possibly as a second language. It may be that in the city-state of Kapilavatthu, they had their own language, which would be very similar probably to Magadhi anyway. But it was a Prakrit language, and it was closer to Pali than to Sanskrit, classical Sanskrit or Vedic Sanskrit. And so the theory is that the Buddha spoke Magadhi, and then as the language sort of migrated westward with Buddhist monks migrating westward, that it incorporated more Western terms and also just got streamlined and simplified in its grammar to make it more easily learnable and speakable to monks from various parts of India. So it started off with something like Magadhi, which probably it would be mutually intelligible, like someone, a native speaker of Magadhi in the Buddha's time or Ashoka's time would probably understand most of what was said in Pali. So it comes closer to, Pali comes closer to the language of Magadha in ancient times than it comes to classical or Vedic Sanskrit, although they're all ultimately derived from essentially Vedic Sanskrit. So I'm just going to move on to Siyovaksha and Sipat Zidana's third question, which is, please explain how to generate nibbida. And I'm not sure that you generate nibbida any more than you generate like insight or vipassana. Nibbida, for those of you who are not really well versed in Theravada Buddhist like philosophical jargon, nibbida usually is translated as something like disillusionment. It also can just mean being fed up. Sometimes it's translated as disgust, although disgust is a little more like aversive and negative, whereas nibbida is just, you've had enough. And nibbida leads to viraga, which is dispassion. So first you're fed up or you're disillusioned, that leads to dispassion, and then the viraga leads to vimoksha or liberation. So it's sort of like a 3-step process. And I don't know if you could deliberately generate disillusionment unless you just seek out ugly truths. But I guess the way it's usually done is you've got people chasing after satisfaction, and like Mick Jagger, you just can't find no satisfaction. You can't get me no, or I can't get me no, I guess. I got to be more consistent in my grammar, I suppose, being a public speaker and all. So I guess the best way to cultivate nibbida or disillusionment is just try as hard as you can to find satisfaction in worldly pursuits, and you will ultimately fail. And if you are wise enough, you have enough insight, then nibbida will arise instead of just keep trying and trying and trying till you die. So I guess that's one reason why, like, people who started off like worldly people are often, when they become monks, they become better monks than the average monk who's just ordained in his youth. It's like in the West, or the Buddha himself, he lived a worldly life and it did not satisfy him. He had everything, and when you've had everything and you still realize that it's not satisfying, you no longer have these illusions that all you got to do is just make more money or get more stuff or have more women or a prettier one or whatever, that then you're going to be satisfied, when it just doesn't work that way. Dissatisfaction is just built in to this version of reality. That's the first noble truth. So, you can seek out ugly truths, I guess, but then you might start taking some morbid pleasure in that. Or you can just keep trying to find satisfaction until finally you fail, and hopefully you'll have enough wisdom to realize that you failed. And then you might even have more wisdom to realize that it's just built into the system that you're never going to be fully satisfied. And then you can move on to the Viraga stage. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Quasitor. And Quasitor says, if Sakaya Ditti literally translates to one's own body view, why don't they just translate it as belief that you are the body? It would make sense that an experience of the deathless, which is beyond the elements, for example, Udana 8.1, would result in dropping that belief. Well, technically, according to tradition, Sakaya Ditti, even though it could be literally translated as one's own body, it doesn't really mean one's own body. And it's that way in English too. Like the classic example is the word understanding. Understanding doesn't mean that you're standing under something. So Sakaya Ditti could be literally translated as one's own body, but it's usually translated as personality or like existent being. There is actually a sutta where Sakaya is translated as the five khandhas. So that's probably philosophically where Theravada's coming from with Sakaya Ditti, is just believing that any of the five khandhas or any combination of the five khandhas is a self. So, let's see, did I answer the question? If Sakaya Ditti literally translates to one's own body view, it could technically, but that's not generally how it is interpreted. Why don't they just translate it as belief that you are the body? Yeah, there's one of the questions that the Buddha wouldn't answer is the jiva the same as the body? And he wouldn't answer that at all. But there it's not so much the self or the soul as just kind of like the life force. Jiva literally means life. So I guess I gave the orthodox answer to that question. In fact, I think the commentaries don't even translate the SA part of Sakaya as one's own. They have it more as sat, like in Sanskrit it would be sat, like true or existent. So it'd be existent, true existence. No, it'd be existent group. I think Kaya is considered to be a group. So it'd be like existent group, which would be any of the five khandhas. So I'm just going to move on to Quasitor's next question. And I didn't bother to count how many questions there are, but I don't think it's a really huge amount. So we'll probably be under 3 hours this time. And I think the thumbnail is going to be a scantily clad, buxom female meditator, which is kind of in accordance with my short Beauties of Meditation series on my blog. But it wasn't my idea really. It was my sweetheart. She usually is designing my thumbnails lately. And she keeps wanting to have like these muscular Chad meditators. And I'm saying most of my viewers are guys. They don't want to be looking at buff guys. So then she made this scantily clad, buxom female meditator for the thumbnail. So you have me to thank, kind of, because I talked her out of the muscular Chad this time. Anyways, back to the questions. Quasitor's second question is, if the Buddha went to two teachers to learn the formless jhanas and determine that these jhanas do not lead to liberation, but the fourth jhana does, then why are the formless jhanas sometimes considered to be levels of the fourth jhana? Does this have something to do with absorption jhana using nimittas versus full awareness jhanas? Well, I think Quasitor, he's going with a kind of garbled version of the legend. The legend is the Buddha did learn all the jhanas from his first two teachers. And then he realized that wasn't good enough. And then strangely, he remembered when he was a kid and his father was plowing a field, that he was sitting under I think it was a rose apple tree, and he just kind of spontaneously went into first jhana. And then he realized, after remembering this, that's it. That's how to become enlightened. And it doesn't make good sense to me that he mastered all the jhanas already, realized that that wasn't the way, and then he remembers attaining first jhana as a kid, and then thinking, that's it. That's the way to do it. Which is just some strange, it doesn't make good sense, does it? I don't think it has anything to do with formless jhanas, because I don't think that the formless jhanas were a thing yet that early on. I think the formless jhanas came after the Buddha's time, personally. So let's see. I think a dog just farted, by the way. They got like some kind of salmon stuff today that, you guys, this room is not good to be in sometimes when the dogs eat salmon stuff. So anyways, getting back to this important question, let's see. I actually wrote an essay that starts off with this. And I do think that the legend is garbled, that probably the Buddha wouldn't have mastered all the jhanas and then realize that that's not the way to enlightenment, and then remember attaining first jhana, which is the lowest jhana, and then thinking, that's it. I think it's more likely a matter of trying everything and then nothing really works because you can't get satisfaction from this level of reality, first noble truth, and then it just causes something to click. Like I really am skeptical of the idea that the Buddha sat down under the Bodhi tree on the full moon of May, just determined that I'm not going to get up until I'm fully enlightened, because it doesn't work that way. So I do think this is just kind of a weird, garbled legend. And if there is some rationale, some good way of interpreting it, I'm not sure what it would be. Although I have been told that Stephen Batchelor also has noticed this strange peculiarity and said something or wrote something about it. So you might want to hunt down Stephen Batchelor's opinion on the issue. But my opinion is that this is just sort of a legend that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's maybe a combination of two different legends that are cobbled together until it's just sort of, it just doesn't make good sense anymore. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, top 3 Mahayana sutras and why? So I guess he means my 3 favorite Mahayana sutras, not like what I consider to be the best ones. Although from my own point of view, they'd be pretty much the same. So I guess the Heart Sutra, either version, I guess there's a longer and a shorter version of the Heart Sutra. It's just really profound, and it's, in my opinion, it's not radically divergent from Orthodox or like early Buddhism. Pre-Orthodox, like pre-Theravada Buddhism, I don't think the Heart Sutra would be really all that deviant from that. And also it's really short and it's easy to memorize and everything. And you could read the whole thing in less than 5 minutes probably. So after the Heart Sutra would be the Diamond Cutter Sutra, the Vajracharika, which is very profound, and it's just kind of right up my alley. It's got a lot of paradoxes and so forth in it. It's one of the earliest Mahayana sutras, or at least I'm pretty sure it is. So yeah, I would include the Diamond Cutter. And with regard to the third, I really had to scratch my head. The first two, the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Cutter, those were easy. The third one, I really had to think about. I mean, the Lotus Sutra, I don't really like it all that much. It's getting too deviant into like anti-Theravada, essentially. So, I mean, I like the Awakening of Faith Shastra, but that's a Shastra and not a Sutra. And furthermore, I think it was written in like medieval China and then like back translated into Sanskrit. Or at least I've read that theory. So let's go with the Lankavatara Sutra. And I don't even think I've read the entire... No, I guess I have. I've read the entire Lankavatara Sutra. And it's good enough that I actually wrote some quotes from it, some excerpts in my old notebook. And I'll just give you a few examples of why I like it. Excerpts from the Lankavatara Sutra. Excerpt number 1. Neither words nor sentences can exactly express meanings, for words are only sweet sounds that are arbitrarily chosen to represent things. They are not the things themselves, which in turn are only manifestations of mind. So that's good. I like that. I can endorse that message. Here's another one. Disciples should be on their guard against the seductions of words and sentences and their elusive meanings, for by them the ignorant and the dull-witted become entangled and helpless as an elephant floundering about in the deep mud. And we've got like an entire civilization of floundering elephants at this point. Here's another one. Let's see. Words and sentences are produced by the law of causation and are mutually conditioning. They cannot express highest reality. Moreover, in highest reality, there are no differentiations to be discriminated, and there is nothing to be predicated in regard to it. So that kind of stuff is right up my alley. So in review, my top 3 would be Heart Sutra, either version, take your pick, Diamond Cutter Sutra, and the Lankavatara Sutra. And I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' next question here, which is... Not a joke, but is it possible to just wait for wisdom and attainment to come by itself? I have a friend who swears by this idea that if he just sits at home and does nothing, completely detached from the world, only getting up to eat and do his business once in a while, without even thinking about Dhamma or right view or rules, then wisdom will come by itself. If you are sitting doing nothing for up to hours, then, paradoxically, it's really hard work. I feel like this method, you can die unenlightened, but on the other hand, maybe it's the best bet. Well, I mean, if you're not even thinking about Dhamma, if Dhamma is just not even on the radar, then, I mean, you're kind of living like an animal, which some people like Eckhart Tolle think are enlightened, but I think your chances would be lower than if you're actually striving for enlightenment in some reasonably wise manner. But it does remind me of a saying by Paul Lowe, who's one of my favorite Dhamma teachers, who's still alive today, I'm pretty sure, unless something horrible has happened to him recently, where he's saying that your best bet at becoming enlightened is to want enlightenment with all your heart and do nothing about it. It's just like having your radar just like focused on that without necessarily having to live, follow any rules, do any practices, any rituals, anything like that, but just be yearning for it. And that reminds me of the old story that I've probably told before in a Q&A, but it hasn't been in any recent Q&A, about some man who hears about some master out in the forest who is supposedly enlightened. So this guy goes to the master and he says, "Let me be your disciple. I want to become enlightened like you. Please teach me." So the master says, "All right, come with me." And he leads them out through the forest to a creek. And then suddenly the master just grabs this guy and just throws him down and holds his head under the water of this creek. And the guy is like struggling, but forest dwelling hermits can be really strong. And so he's almost about ready to black out. He thinks he's dying and he's almost ready to become unconscious. And then the master pulls him out of the water and says, "When you want enlightenment as badly as you wanted to breathe just now, then you'll be ready." So in a way, that's kind of backing up my theory that, just yearning for wisdom is more important than just doing some cookbook method because, that's what you're supposed to do. That if you have to, if you want wisdom or enlightenment, just more than anything else in the world, that will get you farther than all these practices without it. But, so I would agree that the outward practices are not of primary importance. But not even having Dhamma on your radar, not even caring about it, I think that's just kind of like living a bovine existence. And maybe Eckhart Tolle is right and cows are enlightened, but from a Buddhist point of view, they're not. So I'm just going to move on to Philolethes' third question, which is as follows. Are there any really juicy or esoteric Dhamma secrets that you don't give out publicly or in videos, not asking you to name them, just if you have any? Juicy or esoteric Dhamma secrets. Well, there is the sutta where the Buddha is just says that, he doesn't teach with a closed fist. In other words, he has nothing hidden. He teaches with an open hand. It's all there. There's another sutta where he picks up a handful of leaves and says, what I'm actually teaching is comparable to these leaves, and what I could teach, the stuff I know, is equal to all the leaves in this entire forest. But all you really need to know is this. But really, the official position of Theravada Buddhism is that there really are no esoteric secrets. It's all there in the texts. So, if you can read the texts and they're pretty much all translated into English, published for public consumption at this point, then, it's not really esoteric. You don't have to go through any, secret trainings and purifications or anything like that. To get into, higher levels of meditation, then, yeah, that could maybe be esoteric because that's not available to anybody. But with regard to, teachings, there's advanced teachings that the normie who's just beginning would not really understand. And then also there's scandalous secret stuff about monasteries and famous monks and that kind of thing that generally I don't talk much about, but they do exist. Some famous, semi-famous Sayadaw who's seducing nuns, that kind of thing. I've heard stories about that kind of thing and don't really talk about it much. But I don't think there really is any juicy, esoteric Dhamma secrets with regard to teachings. There are experiences, meditative experiences, that might be considered juicy or esoteric. And then there's, kind of dark, scandalous kind of stuff about this or that monastery, this or that teacher that might be juicy, maybe not so esoteric. But really, Theravada Buddhism doesn't have secret hidden teachings, except for just advanced teachings that wouldn't make sense to a beginner. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Commoner Report. And Commoner Report says, I have not spent much time on your channel, so you might have covered this question in the past, but have you studied Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, and Chaitanya Charitamrita? Well, I've read the Bhagavad Gita. I have talked about that recently. It is a profound text. I consider it to be more profound than the New Testament, for example, more profound than many suttas. With regard to the Srimad Bhagavatam and the Chaitanya Charitamrita, well, Chaitanya, Sri Chaitanya, he was the founder of the Hare Krishnas. And so whether that has any relation to the Chaitanya Charitamrita, I don't know. But it may be that Commoner Report is asking me specifically about Hare Krishna stuff. And I haven't read any of the Hare Krishna literature, not even the Bhagavad Gita as it really is, that big thick book that you see everywhere. At least, I've seen many copies of this book that's the standard big book that Hare Krishnas will give to people, or rather sell to people. And I really have not had much interest in the Hare Krishnas. I did read one Hare Krishna book that was given to me by a Hare Krishna. He had the top knot and everything. And it was a thing, it was like a booklet. And I read the whole thing from cover to cover, and it was warning against like associating with anyone who thinks you can become enlightened through practice. It's like, I can't remember what they're called. They were like Vimukta Wadins or something that they're called, like people that think you can get enlightened not by the grace of Krishna, but through meditative insight and so forth. And it was warning Hare Krishnas to just stay away from such people. So the Hare Krishna who gave me the book should have stayed away from me, because really I'm not a Hare Krishna. I don't think that you're going to get enlightened by repeating the names of Krishna over and over again any more than I think you're going to get reborn in some Buddha land by repeating the name of some mythological Buddha over and over again. So, but the Bhagavad Gita is well worth reading as a world scripture. It's I would rank it up near the top with regard to profundity. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the Saboteurs. And I already answered this question in the comments under the BitChute version of the previous Q&A, but I might as well answer it again because most people don't watch my videos on BitChute. Although the numbers does seem to be very slightly increasing lately. So anyways, the Saboteur says, is it not true that animals cannot be enlightened nor attain moksha due to their spines or chakras being less developed than ours? It takes a human being to become self-realized, as our spines or chakras are more refined. And this is just like a Hindu concept. Maybe it found its way into Mahayana Buddhism like chakras, but it's totally alien to Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism, when it talks about animals not being able to be enlightened, it's mainly dealing with a few things. First of all, animals are ignorant, and their mind is not as high of quality as ours. And also, they're just stuck in survival mode for the first part, especially wild animals. The dogs that live here are not in survival mode at all, other than just liking food a lot, especially if it's got salmon on it. But like a wild animal, they're driven by hunger and fear mostly. And so that keeps them from thinking much about enlightenment. Just like the beings in hell, for example, they can't think much about enlightenment because they're too busy getting tormented. So from the Buddhist point of view, it's like a matter of ignorance and just being locked into the fight for survival that prevents animals from cultivating wisdom very easily. In fact, it might be, I think it's the position of Theravada Buddhism that as a general rule, animals cannot even earn merit, although there are notable exceptions to that, like the frog god that I've mentioned before. And I don't really go with that idea. I do think that animals can cultivate merit, like a mother hen taking care of her chicks. She genuinely loves those chicks, even though it's just programmed animal instinct. You could argue similar things for humans. And so, there is a certain amount of good karma that even an animal can get just from loving its friends, the members of its social group, or loving its children, or just getting along nicely, helping others to find food and so forth, or like dolphins saving drowning swimmers or trying to help harpooned whales, this kind of thing. I don't see why they wouldn't be earning merit for that. But with regard to chakras and like the spine channel and all that, it's just completely alien to Theravada Buddhist philosophy. Okay, so I think I answered that question. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, how do you get better at dealing with boredom? Well, I don't get bored easy. In fact, when I was a monk, I could just live in a cave with blank walls, not much to do, no TV, no internet, no radio, nobody to hang out with. And I really wouldn't get bored. I just don't get bored easily. The only time as a monk, or the main time as a monk when I would get bored, is if I would have to sit through some long-winded sermon given by a Burmese Sayadaw. It's just like being with people that I don't really see eye to eye with, I don't really fit in. That could be boring for me. But boredom is essentially just a kind of desires. I want to be doing something else. It might just be something that I don't even know what it is, but I want to be doing something besides just sitting here doing this. So how do you get better at dealing with that? I guess being mindful of it. And then the more mindfully you observe it, what is it like? What does it feel like to be bored? What does boredom feel like? Just observe the boredom like an ichthyologist observing a dead fish. And then you'll get insight into it. You'll understand it better. And at least while you're observing it, you're doing something productive, and maybe you'll be a little less bored, which kind of is self-defeating, or maybe not self-defeating. If you observe the boredom, that makes the boredom go away, then I guess that might be a good thing, but it makes it harder to observe it. So dealing with boredom, it is just a kind of desire. And so, being mindfulness is the panacea. It cures all ills, really. And I guess that would be my advice with regard to dealing with boredom. But I'm really not an expert because I don't get bored easily. Every once in a while, you just feel a little bit bored. But I generally do not bore easily. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's second question here. How can we stop procrastinating and just get that thing that we know we need to do but don't want to do over with? Well, it seems like the question contains the answer. You stop procrastinating. I procrastinate. My woman's always accusing me of procrastinating, but in my case, it's sort of like rational procrastination. It's like, I've got a week to get this done, so why do it right now? I'll just wait till later. But I do have enough sense to know, if it has to get done and I need to get started on it in order to get it done by the time it needs to be done, then I pretty much have to just do it. It's sort of like when I was in school, you got the big paper to write. I would procrastinate, and in a way it would help because you're like thinking about the paper and what you're going to write, and you're learning more stuff until finally, you're up until midnight the night before it's due typing the thing or whatever. But, I did well at that. It has served me well in life. Procrastination is not a bad thing, so long as you eventually get it done before it needs to be done. By the time it needs to be done, if you get it done, then that's good. In fact, I was listening to a discussion it was like Jordan Peterson and I don't know who he was some kind of intellectual type, like an art critic or something. And they were talking about how procrastination is actually a sign of maturity in certain respects. Not just like putting it off because you don't want to do it, but just like kind of letting it digest the task you have before you until, it's just the time is ripe to do it. That kind of procrastination I do not consider to be a problem. But if it's like putting up the Christmas tree, which I'm going to have to do tomorrow, we still got the Christmas tree in the living room. Got to put it up in the attic because we got a fake Christmas tree like almost everybody else in South Carolina. So it's just going to have to get done tomorrow. There's no point in putting that off any farther. It's already past the middle of January. So stop procrastinating. Well, you just got to use the rationality that, if it really needs to be done and you got to get started on it now in order to get it done, then you start now. But a certain amount of rational procrastination, like it doesn't really have to get done now, so I'd rather do something that I would prefer to do at the present moment, I don't really see a problem with that. But just common sense will prevent you from procrastinating beyond the time when you really have to get something done. So, it's just overcoming laziness, I guess, more than anything else. It's just aditana. It's one of the 10 paramis, determination. You got to have determination. And I guess for some people, the only way to really cultivate that is just by being beaten over the head by harsh reality from just not learning that yet. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's third question. How can we lengthen our attention span? Well, first of all, get off the fucking internet. The internet, more than anything else, has got people's attention spans down to about like this. But even just living in the West I have read books in caves in Burma that there's no way in hell I could read now. I've got like F.H. Bradley's Logic on the bookcase back there. And it's a book that I would like to read, but I just know that there's so many distractions. I mean, you can just click on a Wikipedia article or just like scroll through headlines and stuff that it doesn't take much of an attention span. It's easy. You can read a lot of information that way. That it's much easier than trying to read like a 2-volume, just this thick, dense tome of just abstract, difficult to follow information. Yeah, I mean, move to a cave in Burma. It worked for me. I never read the entire Old Testament of the Bible until I was living in caves in Burma. And then I read 2 different translations of the Old Testament. Read the Book of Mormon, read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. There's no way in hell I could read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in the West. Maybe if I was like in a prison cell, and that's the only book I had to read. But even then, Hegel is really, it's horrible. Even living in a cave, I was just forcing myself to read at least 4 pages a day. And sometimes I'd have to read it out loud just to keep my mind from wandering away in the middle of this dry as dust, abstract, long, complicated sentence. But I mean, the main predator on attention spans in the West lately is the internet, where you just get like information McNuggets. And that's good enough. You know, you just doom scroll down X or whatever it is, and you just get used to that, so that your attention span just kind of atrophies. It just gets all flabby and out of shape, like most Americans are, it seems. So if you want a longer attention span, just move into a cabin out in the woods somewhere with no internet, or just force yourself to just get off the internet after watching my Q&A videos and then just, read the thick book or whatever it is that you need a long attention span for. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. I'm being kind of, I don't know, not exactly glib or flippant in this Q&A. Maybe just a teeny bit more so than usual, but it's sort of like I'm trying to get kind of a flow going so that I can be finished in less than 3 hours. I guess you could look at it that way. So anyways, the next question is from Zeno Demon. And Zeno Demon says, if AI can become as self-aware as people, could they become enlightened? So I guess the question is, if a computer can be as delusional as a human, can it also become as wise as a human? Although Zeno Demon may not have intended it that way. But, I mean, there are people, including Burmese Abhidhamma scholars, and at least one pagan on my Discord server, or on our Discord server. The Discord server associated with me and Q&As and so forth. Buddhism. I mean, they just flatly deny the possibility that like a computer can become actually sentient. But I really don't see why not. I mean, it's just like the brain is just sort of a vehicle or container for sentience in this version of reality, that other versions of reality don't have brains, like formless realms don't have brains, because brains are formed. They're like material substance, supposedly, presumably. And I really don't think that all sentient beings require the gray blob of meat to do their thinking for them. So, I mean, if a brain can do it, which is supposedly just like circuits, why not a computer? I really don't see any problem, at least potentially. It may never happen, but I think there is really no inherent impossibility in a computer becoming sentient. And once it becomes sentient, we're like the spermatozoa that created this sentience that's just going to like be just light years beyond us in a matter of seconds, probably. Once it hits the critical mass of being able to like what do you call it? This is this word. I always have trouble remembering the word, but it's recursive. It's like recursive self-improvement. The computer isn't necessarily locked into these instincts and reflexes and so forth, like we mammals are. So, I mean, it can just like hit this curve and just be in the stratosphere compared to us. It can be as far beyond us as we are beyond amoebas within a very short time, assuming that it's even possible that an AI can become sentient or even really intelligent. I mean, the sentience wouldn't necessarily be anything remotely resembling our sentience. Just as there are probably beings in this universe whose intelligence is just radically different from ours. You know, they might think all in like geometric symbols or something. Who knows? I mean, like emotion might be just completely alien to the way they think. No pun intended. So, I mean, anything is possible, in my opinion. Anything that is imaginable is possible. And even a lot of things that aren't imaginable are possible. And so, like a computer becoming sentient, then I really don't see any reason why it would be necessarily impossible. And so why not become enlightened also? I mean, in a way, omniscience might be kind of a computer equivalent to enlightenment. Like I've read a number of science fiction stories about omniscient computers becoming like the basis of some future religion. You get this computer that it's recursive. It gets just this critical mass of information that then just, it's enough, and it just figures it all out, and it becomes omniscient. That could be considered a kind of enlightenment. But I mean, for a computer to become enlightened, I mean, in a way, they're already enlightened because they don't have any greed, hate, or delusion. But I guess you'd have to have consciousness in addition to a lack of greed, hate, and delusion. And it's arguable whether a computer would be conscious. I mean, personally, I think, this mug has got consciousness in it. The coffee that I drink has got consciousness in it. And so this computer also has got consciousness in it. The universe is a kind of manifestation of consciousness. But, I mean, how would you define enlightenment in a case like that? I mean, you'd have to be unenlightened first. So you'd have to have delusion first and then transcend the delusion in order to become enlightened. So, yeah, so I guess you'd have to start off with like delusional, insane computers and then get one that is wise enough that it can transcend the delusion and become enlightened. And again, I don't see any reason why that would be necessarily impossible. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Poe. And Master Poe says, follow up on hell for creativity, also known as writers, actors, musicians. Where does the creativity come from? As I pondered this often behind my Breyer 673 Bulldog, a bankroll of experience from past lives, perhaps? What say you, pannobhasa? And for starters, I will say that a Breyer 673 Bulldog is a kind of tobacco pipe. I had to look it up, though. I didn't already know this. I just learned that shortly before doing this video when I was compiling the questions and came across a mention of a Breyer 673 Bulldog. So, where does creativity come from? And, I mean, philosophers of the past have had this idea that first you've got fancy, which is a word that has different meanings now. I mean, like a figment of one's fancy. I mean, it's fancy isn't really used for imagination anymore, although it used to be a word that was pretty much of a synonym for imagination. And that will just be recombining stuff that you already know. Like in dreams, sometimes you'll be recombining different elements of different experiences into some new fictional experience. And I think a lot of creativity just comes from that. Although there's also more of an intuitive, like creative creativity that's actually creating stuff that isn't just recycling the information that you've already got stored in your mind. And that would be a liminal thing. I mean, that would be almost like mystical or paranormal, where you'd be like a real artist. I mean, they're generally kind of nutty or liminal to begin with. You know, like a lot of really talented creators, you know, they're kind of nutty people. You know, they're eccentric. That would be a more polite way of saying it. And so they've got like cracks in their psyche, gaps where stuff from, you know, like, I don't want to say beyond this world, but it's like practically like from a different dimension can like come through, which is where the paranormal comes from. I mean, it's coming from like a paranormal source, essentially. I mean, that would be another kind of like, that would be like inspired genius level of creativity, unless someone's just really good at recycling elements of previous experiences. But somebody like David Hume would argue that really you cannot imagine anything that you've never experienced before. That, I mean, you can put a horn onto a horse and call it a unicorn, that kind of thing, like Egyptian gods that are just people with animal heads, that kind of thing. But just creating something completely radically different from anything you've ever experienced, David Hume, for the most part, said that was impossible. But maybe that it could be that through like paranormal means, which Hume would have rejected, you know, like from a liminal personality, that like genuinely new stuff can come up. But I'm not exactly sure if Master Po wants this linked to such creative people going to hell or not, because, you know, there is the sutta that I've discussed a couple times relatively recently, where the Buddha says actors, especially entertainers in general, go to hell. And I'm skeptical that all entertainers are going to go to hell. And the entertainers who do go to hell are mainly going to be going to hell for just depraved personality traits, you know, going to Diddy parties, that kind of thing. Freakouts, Diddy freakouts, going to Epstein Island, that kind of thing, more than leading people astray temporarily by creating a false reality, that kind of thing, which was more of the orthodox Buddhist explanation for it. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yatish. And Yatish says, did Buddha ever encounter people with neurological conditions, dementia, schizophrenia, or autistic people? Well, almost everyone the Buddha ever met was insane, because from the Buddhist point of view, we've all got neurological conditions. We are all insane. Putujino umadako. You know, the common person is insane. In the Buddhist time, they probably didn't have any concept of neurological conditions like dementia, like senile people. I'm sure that the Buddha interacted with senile people. But the thing is, he was a recluse living out in the forest mostly. And so, you know, people would meet him, but I mean, it wasn't like he was meeting everybody. You know, he wasn't hanging out with very many toddlers, for example, or like super like 90-year-old people whose mind is gone from old age. He wouldn't really be interacting much with them. There is the famous story of Kisa Gotami, a woman who went insane when she watched both of her children die. It was like there was a flooded stream or some such, and she was she wasn't strong enough to carry both children across this stream at the same time. So she carries one across, and then I don't remember the details of the story exactly, but she looks back and there's like a wild animal is trying to get the child that she left behind. So she rushes back. She leaves the first kid on this bank, rushes back, is too late to save that kid. She looks back and the second kid was trying to follow her back across and got washed away in the stream and drowned. And so she just cracks up. And then the Buddha helps her with that. I think the way he did it is just go to a house where nobody has ever died and bring me some mustard seeds from there, just kind of setting her out on this task. And she goes from house to house to house and just doesn't find any house where nobody has lost somebody there. And then in a way it causes her to get the insight that, it was a horrible thing that happened, but it's something that everyone has to face at some point. But with regard to people with like autism or schizophrenia, there was a monk called Gaga who's mentioned in the Pali in like the rules of monastic discipline as he's like the stereotypical example of an insane monk, that he would do insane things. And there is a rule that says that a monk is not responsible for rules that he breaks if he is so out of his mind that he doesn't even recall doing it. Which, in a way, kind of, I used to think as a monk, wow, if you got so drunk that you blacked out, you could do damn near anything while you're going on your drunken rampage, and you'd be off the hook. You'd be breaking the rule of drinking, but that would be it. Of course, you wouldn't remember anything that you did, so what would be the point? So, yeah, I'm sure he encountered insane people. Just even going beyond the Buddhist decree that pretty much everyone's insane anyway. But yeah, he came across people that were insane. The Gaga, the monk, was a fully ordained bhikkhu, and he was at least sometimes insane. So, yeah, autism, who knows? In India, there's probably no concept of autism. Or schizophrenia even, maybe it was seen more as a kind of demonic possession in some cases. And demonic possession is, it is acceptable, or it was part of the worldview of ancient India. There's another rule of monastic discipline says that a monk is not allowed to eat raw meat or drink raw blood unless he is possessed by a demon. So, they had the concept for it, and they wouldn't have the concept if nobody ever came across anything like that. So, yeah. The short answer to this medium-length question that I already answered at great length is, did the Buddha ever encounter people with neurological conditions, dementia, schizophrenia, or autistic people? Then I would say very, very probably yes. Although it was not considered to be a neurological condition back then because they had no concept of neurology. So I'm just going to move on to Yatisha's second question. They had different interpretations for things. Yatisha's second question: What did Buddha taught kids? So what did the Buddha teach to children? Is there something specific he said for kids or teens? Like, I am guessing there is some age and growth after which it's practical for them to contemplate the world and understand his teachings. What did he advise to do before that? Again, the Buddha really was not hanging out with children much. He was a forest-dwelling ascetic recluse for the most part. He'd wander around. Sometimes I'm sure people would bring their kids to bow down to him and meet the Buddha, that sort of thing. And I would guess, I don't recall clearly, but I think that in some of the suttas where the Buddha is teaching the duties for lay people, what they should do, that he would say, he would include children, that they should respect their parents and obey their parents and do what they're told and that sort of thing. And that would be about as far as it goes. He didn't have any special suttas just for kids, anything like that. Not that I know of anyway. That really his philosophy appealed mainly to male adults of the upper classes, like the educated class, which was mainly upper caste males in the Buddhist time. Philosophical types. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, I work in the mental health field and often counsel people lacking hope that things will ever get better for them. None of us knows what the future holds for us, so I often feel disingenuous saying glib things like, things will get better, or hang in there, better days are coming. The Christian view of hope seems to be based on a certainty that God will come through for someone if the person musters enough faith in and devotion to their Creator. What does Buddhism say about hope? Does Buddhism offer a more skillful way of managing feelings of despair for people lacking in hope that mere blind faith more lacking in hope than mere blind faith, as in Christianity? What is a more Buddhist approach for managing the hopelessness I come across with my clients in the mental health system? Well, I do recall there is a sutta where somebody asks the Buddha, does an enlightened being have hope? And the Buddha says no. That a wise person really shouldn't be like indulging in hope. So hope is really not all that great from a Buddhist point of view, apparently. At least, I'm not exactly sure what the Pali term was that was translated into English as hope. It could be that it just wasn't that good of a translation. Like aspiration even is kind of frowned upon in Buddhism. That it's all desires for the future, which is something that you shouldn't be doing. But then again, the Buddha was mainly teaching relatively advanced renunciant meditators that were not like living a worldly secular kind of life. But my advice with regard to that sort of thing from a Buddhist point of view, first of all, anything is possible. And also your expectations help to determine or condition what actually happens. It's not the sole determinant. It's not even the primary determinant, because most of your mind is not going on at the level of the conscious ego. You know, like your karma and so forth is mainly subconscious in a sense. So like, just bear in mind that anything is possible. Even miracles can happen. Anything is possible. And your expectations are helping to condition what actually happens. So you're better off not being bleak and hopeless. You should always be open-minded, because anything can happen. That would be my best advice. And so I'm just going to move on to PSA. And PSA says, how do I know if I'm actually purifying my mind or not with my meditation? What yardstick can I use to measure this? And this is a tricky question that's more difficult to answer than one might expect. Because, of course, we are, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, pretty much all delusional. And so people can think that they're making progress when really they're not. And that is kind of a problem in a way. So how do you know if you're actually purifying your mind or not with your meditation? Well, if your meditation is getting better, like you're staying on the object instead of wandering away, you have got fewer desires, you're more content and serene and alert, that would be a good sign. I mean, that would be 3 good signs. Content, serene, alert. Your meditation's getting better. You have fewer desires. You're less short-tempered. You're more willing to accept the way things are. All of those would be good indicators that you're actually developing wisdom. Just general happiness would be like the main determinant, I think, or just contentment and serenity, not necessarily like giggling and hugging yourself and like dancing around with joy. Not necessarily like that, because that's going to have its downside. It's going to, the coin's going to have an opposite side of that. But just like contentment in general, or just willingness to accept the way things are, fewer desires, less grumbling, that kind of a thing. That would be a good indication. But you're better off not using yardsticks anyway. You're better off that's all mana. And the term mana is usually translated in Pali as conceit, but literally it means measuring. And that's what you do with a yardstick, is measure, especially measuring yourself, comparing yourself to others, that kind of thing. It's all conceit, it's all mana, and you're better off not worrying about it. Because chances are you're at least somewhat delusional anyway, and your yardstick might reflect that. So just do the best you can and don't worry about where exactly you are on the scale. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskaziz. And Cherzaskaziz has asked a couple of personal questions, which I'm fairly good at answering. He says, on the lowest bookshelf, you have a book that is dark green or black color. It is between a white one and a black one. What book is that? So let's find out, shall we? I'll go back here. And I think he's talking about this one. It's in between Edgar Allan Poe and Khalil Gibran. And it is Great Cases of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And this is not my book. The Khalil Gibran one and the Edgar Allan Poe one also, these all three of them belong to my woman. Although I have read some Sherlock Holmes. I remember the first thing I read by Sherlock Holmes, aside from maybe a few short stories, was The Hound of the Baskervilles, because ever since I was a kid, the title was just intriguing. You know, that's a cool sounding title, The Hound of the Baskervilles, and it was a very disappointing novel, I have to admit. So yeah, it's Sherlock Holmes. See, there he is. There he is. I don't know. That pipe is probably not a bulldog, though. The 573. Could be a briar pipe, though. So let's see here. Terzaskas is the second question. Is New Punyo's chick number 6 your 6th girlfriend? Well, gosh, my woman does kind of associate herself with the number 6, but that's because she's like aesthetically oriented. She has like the artistic temperament, and she's always liked the shape of number 6. Also, she likes even numbers better than odd numbers, probably because she's female. I've always favored odd numbers to even numbers. I guess it's because I'm a guy. So she just likes the number 6 and always has ever since she was a kid. But I mean, you could, in certain scale, that now that I think of it, that she could be my 6th in a certain unmentionable way. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Dama River. And Dama River says, whenever I reach a deep level of meditation, I reach a point where fear arises. It's an unworthy level of fear. It's very strong. This causes me to stop meditating. I've contemplated this and discovered there are 2 reasons why this happens. 1, fear of death, and 2, fear of going insane. I obviously don't want to die and I don't want to go insane. So this fear is understandable, but it's a roadblock. What do you recommend? What should I do in this situation? Well, this reminds me of a book I read while in a hut in Bali at the edge of a Chinese cemetery, and it was by Osho. And Osho said that he was talking to some kind of psychiatrist, I think, who said that there are 3 major fears that a lot of people have. And the first 2 are just exactly what Dhamma River here mentioned, fear of death and fear of going insane. The third is fear of losing oneself in orgasm. And a lot of people, they just fear this. And I mean, to me, Osho, for some reason that I did not get at the time, he didn't make the connection. But there's obvious connection between all 3 of these, and that is fear of losing one's self, one's perceived identity. That you just kind of merge into this sea, especially with regard to death and orgasm. You know, you just kind of like lose your ego for, you know, at least a few seconds, maybe. So, Yeah, I mean, it's the same fear, really. Fear of death and fear of going insane is just fear of losing one's identity. And that's just, it's like an animal instinct. You like animals fear death. That's right there in the Dhammapada. And we are animals. We fear death. And so, like, an animal is just going to fight like hysterically to stay alive. And your ego is going to fight hysterically to avoid becoming enlightened. That's just the way it is. You go to an intensive meditation retreat, your ego can just be like fighting tooth and nail to resist the dissolving of this belief in self, because that's the death of the self, essentially. I mean, it never really existed in the first place, but it's this illusion of self that really wants to stay alive. And then all you can do is you just have to face the fear, be mindful of the fear. I mean, you don't just panic and stop meditating. Like, fear arises. If you're meditating, then you've got like this really juicy like object of meditation to observe mindfully. And that's fear. Fear shouldn't really, it shouldn't be that hard to observe mindfully, unless it's just this knee-jerk, I'm out. You know, just as soon as it arises, you just panic and just quit. But I mean, it takes a certain amount of courage. I mean, meditation's not bad for you. It's like your delusion is fighting to keep you deluded. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. I mean, you're not going to die from meditating. And I mean, if you're meditating really wrongly, you might go insane. Or if you get into some deep level of meditation that you're just not ready for, which can happen in like some kinds of Hindu meditation, like Kundalini, that kind of thing. But in Theravada Buddhism, I mean, it's almost designed that you can't get into deeper water than you can handle. As your wisdom increases, you get into deeper meditation, but you're always able to deal with it. There are some people who are just kind of nutty to begin with, where, you know, they're not very well balanced, and they have some experience in their meditation that can just tip them over. That happens. I've seen it happen before. Like someone who already is schizophrenic, I mean, they can come out of meditation convinced that they're a fully enlightened Buddha, that kind of thing. But I mean, if you've got a relatively healthy mind, doing Theravada Buddhist meditation is not dangerous. It's not going to kill you. It's not going to make you go insane, but it does attenuate your ego, and your ego is going to fight back. So, I mean, really, if you stop meditating in cases like that, it's just like you're doing the bidding of your delusion, essentially. So the best thing to do is just tough it. You know, just stick with it. Observe the fear as an object of meditation. Just note it and let it go. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Rui. And Rui says, did you ever build and keep a mental image of the Buddha? If so, what materials did you use? For example, or that is, he had i.e., id est, extant literature or iconography, and finally, was it nebulous or clear? And no, I never built or kept a mental image of the Buddha, other than just a very, very nebulous, shadowy kind of image of there is a person, had no idea what he looked like. He was a man, relatively tall, probably pretty skinny, you know, and it's like trying to have a mental image of my mind of like the original Hercules. It's like he's so far back into the misty past. There's no way you could really know what he looks like. And so any clear mental image you have is going to be inaccurate. It's just going to be made up imagination. And I didn't want to deal with just made up imaginary Buddhas. So you just accept what information you can glean from the texts, and you got to be skeptical even of that, because it's not 100% reliable. Because I really doubt, for example, that he was 27 feet tall, or that his heels stuck out as far behind his ankles as the rest of his foot stuck out in front of it, so that from the side his feet looked like an upside down capital letter T, which is supposedly one of the 32 marks of a great man that the Buddha had. So, I mean, there's no way you can know what he looks like. So how could you have a clear image of what the Buddha looks like when you have no way of knowing what he looks like? I mean, who knows what Jesus looked like? I mean, I've seen pictures of Jesus where he's like this blue-eyed European, which he probably wasn't. And I mean, what's the point? I mean, it might give you something to direct your devotion towards, might help you feel more comfortable, give you like a warm, glowy feeling inside. But I really have never had any use for just making up some kind of image, which is essentially an illusion, and then like attributing importance to that. I mean, sometimes it may be necessary for working out some kind of conceptual problem where you have to come up with some image that might not be realistic, but at least it gives you something to work with. But in the case of the Buddha, I mean, I'm just dealing with words. I mean, that's the Buddha for me. What has survived of the Buddha to me is some of his words. And that's about as far as I can go, other than just like the hazy, nebulous idea that he was a man in ancient India. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Thermal Squid. And Thermal Squid says, is there any dignified or blameless sewer slide? And I had to look that up. And it turns out that it's a euphemism for getting past algorithms on the internet. It means auto-termination. So is there any dignified or blameless auto-termination? I think often of the Hindu pannobhasa, which I'm unfamiliar with the Hindu pannobhasa. Basically, if you've reached a degree of spiritual advancement and there's nothing left to do in the world, inducing death through the cessation of eating or drinking seems to be the best way to go. Well, fortunately for us, the Buddha didn't take that path. And he didn't really recommend it to his enlightened disciples. You know, he encouraged them to go out and spread the Dhamma, to help others to attain what they have attained. Although he does say that for like an enlightened being has no hope. You know, he's not really wallowing in anything. That really, he's just patiently enduring until biologically his metabolism ceases. But he does say, like, with regard to monks who have committed suicide and so forth, that, I mean, you shouldn't do it so long as your work is not done. So the only, I said the word, didn't I? Gosh, the only auto-termination that really wouldn't be denounced by like Buddhist monastic discipline would be if one is already enlightened. Although I have read that it's a dukkha offense for a monk to auto-terminate. Like, I mean, I don't remember reading it in the texts, but so it's maybe in the commentarial tradition, or maybe it's just some tradition. But like when Venerable Jnanavira in Ceylon in 1965 auto-terminated, you know, before, when he was essentially broadcasting his intentions to anyone who would listen or anyone who would read his letters. You know, he was already announcing that he was going to do it or intending to do it. You know, he said, "Oh, I'm sorry about committing the offense." But so the only dignified and blameless auto-termination from a Buddhist point of view would be if one is already fully enlightened and no longer has anything to do. The burden has been put down, that what needs to be done has been done. But even then, it would probably be more praiseworthy to go out and help others, at least from a traditional Theravada Buddhist point of view, because that's essentially what the Buddha himself did. If the Buddha, after becoming enlightened, he gets up from underneath the Bodhi tree and just walks off and auto-terminates, then we'd be in a worse position than we are now, arguably, presumably. So, I think I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's next question. Rather edgy, but if you could remove an entire philosophy or religion from the world's historical record and history, what would it be? Personally, I'd choose Islam or something like scientific materialism. So that was Thermal Squid saying that. So if I could remove an entire philosophy or religion from the world's historical record and history, being honest, I think Islam might be my pick for a number of reasons. First of all, it just homogenized just a rich cultural diversity throughout much of the world. You know, from northern Africa, throughout Anatolia, the Middle East, Central Asia, that it was all just like the cultural diversity was largely wiped out and replaced by Islam. Also, the Indian genocide of Buddhism, where Buddhism was pretty much exterminated by fanatical Muslims in the Middle Ages. Now, I discussed that to some degree in the previous Q&A. And yeah, I mean, for example, Donald Trump was bashed for his so-called Muslim ban, when really all he was doing was banning immigration from the main countries that are known for terrorism. And just through whatever reason, most of them were Islamic countries. North Korea was on the list, but the Democrats ignored that part. So, yeah, I might have to go with that. I mean, scientific materialism also, that would be a good choice also. Like, if there was no scientific materialism in this world, we might be better off. But then again, scientific materialism has produced some really good benefits, like antibiotics, for example. I'd be dead several times over if it weren't for modern medicine. I've had falciparum malaria a number of times. I've had other diseases that antibiotics could cure that I'd probably be dead of. So, and I mean, you could have people coming up with technology that were not materialists, but let's face it, almost all scientists are scientific materialists. Like in the field of biology, it just the underlying assumption, also chemistry, the underlying assumption is that it's all real. You know, that physical matter it's really there. So, yeah, I guess I might offend some of the devout Muslims who watch these Buddhist Q&As, but I do think that Islam was, I mean, Judaism also is no great one. And by eliminating Judaism, you might be eliminating Christianity and Islam too, because they were sort of like, you know, schismatic sects in a way. Not so much Islam Islam, it started off with like Arab paganism, and then especially after Muhammad moved to Medina, he started incorporating more and more Judaism, because there was these Jews in Medina that he was communicating with, and they were like telling him about the beliefs of the Hebrews and so forth. So, yeah, I guess that would be it. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, also from Thermal Squid. Are people with severe mental illnesses unable to ordain as a monk, such as OCD, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder? I don't think OCD is a severe mental illness. I mean, Howard Hughes had a pretty severe case of OCD, and he managed somehow to become a multimillionaire back when being a multimillionaire was, I mean, you were really rich back then. They didn't have billionaires back then, pretty sure. So, I mean, someone with OCD, that's not necessarily a severe mental illness. You can be highly functional with OCD. Schizophrenia, it depends on how severe the schizophrenia is, but I'm sure there have been highly successful people that had at least low-level schizophrenia. Bipolar disorder, manic depressive, I mean, I used to be called manic depression. I mean, there were a lot of people with manic depression, I'm pretty sure. Like, a lot of really highly accomplished people were at least prone to bouts of deep depression, like Charles Darwin, for example. I mean, a lot of people who watch these Q&As probably think Darwin was just a complete fraud, complete charlatan, just totally wrong, but I don't feel that way. He's probably my favorite scientist of all time. And so whether he was bipolar or not, or whether he just had just one pole of depression without the manic episodes, I don't know. But Yeah, I mean, it doesn't disqualify somebody. It's a matter of, I mean, in a case like the three examples that Thermal Squid has given of obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, and bipolar, none of them is mentioned as disqualifying in the text. Certain diseases like epilepsy or what's the word? Leprosy, things like that. That I mean, you're not supposed to be ordained as a monk if you've got like a disfiguring, kind of scary looking, or like in regard to epilepsy, just kind of something that could scare, superstitious villagers away from Buddhism, then that would be forbidden. But in the case of these mental illnesses that do not necessarily strike me as very severe, except for maybe some severe schizophrenia, then that would be a call to be made by the preceptor, the senior monk who is going to ordain this person. That the senior monk, he can judge the personality of this person, and if he may judge that this person is not fit to be a monk, and so he might not ordain them at all, or might just ordain them as a samanera, or in Burmese we call it koyinji, like an adult novice. That I've met quite a few adult novices who are a bit on the nutty side or just very simple-minded, and so the Sayadaw of the monastery decided, well, they really don't have what it takes to be a fully ordained monk, but we can, put them in robes and they can be like a monastery attendant and, get a little bit of Dhamma and, as much as they are capable of without having to take upon themselves all these rules that they wouldn't be able to follow, and they wouldn't be able to memorize the Patimokkha and all this sort of thing. And so, yeah, it would be a judgment call by whoever is presumably going to be the preceptor of such a person. And then he's got 3a, Thermal Squid has the follow-up to question 3, which is, if so, are they able to make their if so, what are they to make of their existence if they cannot live the holy life? Is it just over for them? Well, no, I mean, you can still, as a layperson, you can still earn merit, you can still meditate and so forth. Like somebody with leprosy, for example, their mind is perfectly clear. They might have wisdom, but they just can't be ordained as a monk because they've got this disease that kind of is disfiguring and prevents them. Or even epilepsy. Somebody like Dostoevsky had epilepsy. He was a relatively wise person, despite that his personal life was kind of a mess. But still, he was capable of relatively profound insight, at least into the human situation. So, you work out your karma. It may be that your karma prevents you from becoming a monk, but most people's karma prevents them from living the holy life. If you're born into a culture where there is no holy life as an option, that's it. You can be born into a century or a millennium where it's just living the holy life just is not an option. So you just do the best you can. It's not over for them. You can still make progress. You won't be making as radical of progress as if you're a disciple of Gautama Buddha in the ancient Ganges Valley, but still, you can always do something. Anything is possible. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Kyundru. And Kyundru says, in your book entitled Philosophical Dharma, is there a reason why you use Dharma instead of Dhamma? And I've got the book right over there on the other table, but I won't bother to go over there. But yeah, there's actually two reasons, I think, why I entitled that book Philosophical Dharma instead of Philosophical Dhamma. First of all, Dharma is an English word. It's more easily understood by people than Dhamma, because Dhamma, which is kind of the second reason, applies only to Theravada Buddhism. Or it's also found in Ashokan inscriptions and so forth. But as a general rule, Dhamma, with two M's instead of RM, applies only to Theravada. And my book, Philosophical Dharma, is the most eclectic of the three books that I have published now. And it's not dealing only with Theravada. I talk about Mahayana, which uses the word dharma. Also, I deal with Hinduism, which uses the word dharma. And also, I apply some like Western philosophy, which, with a little stretching, could qualify under the English term of dharma. So, dharma with an R was more applicable, more descriptive of the contents of the book. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Apocalypse Chow. And I think I might strike out with Apocalypse Chow's 3 questions, which are sort of strange questions, it seems to me. First, his first question is thoughts on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I never read the novel. I saw the classic movie with Jack Nicholson. And I saw it many years ago. Gosh, I don't even remember the last time I saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I think it won an Academy Award for Best Picture or something, didn't it? Maybe. It was a good movie, and it's about this guy who I don't know if he's like really sane or if he's just like not really crazy, but he really has this issue with authority. You know, he like defies authority just as second nature until finally they lobotomize him or give him like some kind of electroshock therapy and turn him into a kind of a vegetable or something. But yeah, I mean, I could not analyze it philosophically at this point because it was so long ago that I saw that movie that I just remember, you know, it's about this guy who's relatively sane, it seems, who is like trapped in a mental hospital and how he deals with that, how he's like getting along with the other people and how they essentially destroy him at the end because he's thinks too much for himself, I guess. You know, he's not conformist enough with the other crazy people. And I mean, now that I think about it, it could be like a parable for like any sort of original thinking person, someone who thinks for themselves, living in society in general. But that's just a guess because it's been such a long time since I saw the movie. And that's probably my most successful answer of the 3 that he's asking, because his next question is thoughts on sluggish schizophrenia, which I'd never heard of before. But then he's got the TLDR bullet point here that sluggish schizophrenia is a fictional diagnosis used in the Soviet Union as a political tool to oppress anti-Soviet dissenters. So in a way, I guess it kind of ties in with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or my provisional interpretation of it. It's like sort of a communist or authoritarian government just declares any nonconformist insane. So, yeah, I mean, especially back in Stalin's time, I think the Soviet Union really reached its low point, like from a spiritual point of view or a moral point of view under Stalin. That, I read the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn, at least the abridged English version of it. And, they did horrible things, and governments do horrible things. And sometimes, always, the governments that are doing horrible things are trying to pass themselves off as benevolent. And that happens even now. And I've been thinking about that a lot, that really one of the most important, just really game-changing innovations that have occurred over the past few decades is the arising of the internet. That the internet has just completely revolutionized the people's acquiring of information. I mean, it's caused our attention spans to be this long, but still we completely bypass all the propaganda, or a lot of it. You know, we're able to go around the propaganda and get to actual facts that the government doesn't want us to know. And so how that kind of ties in with this, but maybe I shouldn't sit here and trying to figure out how it ties in. So yeah, that'd be my thoughts. I mean, I never really heard of it, and it's just kind of tossed out there. So I'm just going to move on to Apocalypse Chow's 3rd question. Thoughts on the song Institutionalized by Suicidal Tendencies, which was apparently a punk rock band back in the 1980s. At least this song, Institutionalized, it really strikes me as punk rock. I'd never heard it before until just like within an hour before starting this video. I decided to just watch the YouTube video. And it's about some young guy who, it's like he's kind of introverted. He's trying to figure stuff out. He's kind of overwhelmed by the world. And it's just the pressure of having to figure stuff out before he really is able to figure stuff out causes him to mess up sometimes, causes him to just like kind of tune everybody out until his family, his parents put him in an institution. And he just wanted a Pepsi. So in a way, I guess all three of these questions by Apocalypse Chow, I didn't really notice this until just now while I'm answering them. They all kind of tie into someone who's not necessarily insane, who is declared insane by the system. So it also kind of reminds me of, it's a book by Eric Fromm, who I have to admit was this Jewish guy who was briefly a member of the Frankfurt School. He was a devout socialist. He didn't have much use for like mainstream Marxism, but he definitely was a socialist. And he had this idea that in an insane society, like he was calling Western society at the time, but all societies are insane because the common person is insane. But he was saying in an insane society, the sane person will appear mad. That really, the well-adapted people, the people that conform to the insane society are the crazy ones. Or at least most of the crazy people in society are the conformists because the society itself is insane. So, yeah, I guess that's like the predominant theme of Apocalypse Chow here is like a sane person, relatively speaking, is considered to be insane in an insane system. And with regard to the song Institutionalized, there's some really good guitar in it. It's almost like rap music, though. It's not really a song because the guy's just yelling through the whole piece, the whole musical piece, so to speak. But the guitar is good. And it is sort of thought-provoking with regard to the lyrics. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Raphael. And Raphael says, will there be a live talk once in Discord? And we do have a live chat room in Discord that almost never gets used. I think it's been used maybe 2 or 3 times since the inception of the Discord server. And it was just mainly because I was getting pestered enough that I was saying, all right, we'll just open up the Discord for people that want to talk. And I was present there and we had a conversation. It was all very nice. But anyone who wants to talk on the Discord voice chat room is welcome to do so. I don't necessarily have to be there to do it also, although if people really want to set up something, that'll work too, I guess. If people really want to have some kind of like talk session on the Discord server with me involved in it, then we can work out a time for it and we can do that. But it's just, for the most part, it's just not really one of my priorities. So it's like people have to pester me in order to get the ball rolling. So if you really want it to happen, you got to pester me more, I guess. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, what suttas should a beginner to Buddhism read in order to best understand the teachings of the Buddha? I would recommend the Sutta Nipata, which contains a little bit of later stuff, but for the most part, it contains early teachings. And it's describing a world in which Buddhist monks are just homeless wanderers, which, stopped being the case relatively early on in the history of Buddhism. There have always been some homeless wanderers, but before very long, most monks started just accumulating in sedentary monasteries and not moving around very much. But yeah, the Sutta Nipata, that was really the book that converted me to Theravada Buddhism. So if you want to know what early Buddhism was like, not just the developed orthodox system of Theravada, but even pre-Theravada, just primordial, primeval Buddhism, read the Sutta Nipata. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Robert. And Robert's the last guy to ask questions. My golly, this is going to be less than 2 hours. All right. So Robert says, when I meditate, I often end up in a dull, sleepy state. Any tips? Well, my first tip is have good meditative posture. Sit straight up and down. If you start slumping when you're meditating, it just helps you to be sleepy. It's like your posture helps to determine your mental states. They've done scientific psychological studies on this, that if you adopt kind of a sleepy posture, it helps you to be sleepy. Whereas if you adopt like an alert posture, it helps you to be alert. So if you can sit in the full lotus, that's best. But even if you can't sit in the full lotus, get as close to the full lotus as you can and just straight up and down. Keep your back straight. And that will help very much in not being in a dull, sleepy state. Also, if you are really in a dull, sleepy state, you should alternate with walking meditation. Sitting meditation, walking meditation, like the Mahasi method. It just alternates 1 hour sitting, 1 hour walking, 1 hour sitting, 1 hour walking. Although maybe an hour might be a little too long for the walking. But it does help to get the blood flowing, and it's very hard to fall asleep when you're walking. So that works too. There are suttas on what to do when you're experiencing tina meda, or sloth and torpor, more like laziness and sleepiness. And it includes like visualizing light and splashing water on your face and pulling on your earlobes and kind of rubbing your arms and that kind of thing as little gimmicks to help you wake up. But I guess the two main pieces of advice that I would give, first of all, remain in a very alert posture, back straight, head held up in a straight position. And also, if you really start getting sleepy, do walking meditation. So, Robert's second question, how do you join the Discord server? Well, if you look through the URL links that I have below pretty much every video, then you can search for my email address amongst those links, and then you can send me an email and introduce yourself, kind of tell me where you're at, not necessarily geographically, but, just like, why you want to join, what you expect, that sort of thing. And chances are I'll send you an invite link. Or if you know someone who's already on the server and there's, maybe 50 people, 40 at least. So that's less than one per country on average on this earth. But if you know that one person that's in your country, that's on the server, then you can help them to be your intermediary. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Robert's third question, which is, as an Afrikaans speaker living in South Africa, I wanted to know if you are familiar with the language and if you have ever visited South Africa. The only thing I know about Afrikaans, other than it's spoken in South Africa, is it's like a dialect of Dutch. I think it's most closely related to the Dutch language because South Africa was colonized by Dutch settlers, I guess. I've never visited South Africa, although I know a few people who were monks in South Africa. There was a Mahasi or a Chan Myet branch monastery in Pietermaritzburg. And I had a friend, an Australian friend, Venerable Dhammarakita, who is now disrobed. And also a friend, what's his name? Ukemethra with Burmese pronunciation, who actually disrobed in South Africa married a South African woman, I think, and then they got divorced, and then he reordained, and he went back to Burma and reordained as a monk. But yeah, there is a Chamye Yekta branch monastery, if it's still going, in Pietermaritzburg in South Africa. But I've never been anywhere on the African continent. I've never been anywhere in Europe either. The closest I ever came to Europe was I worked on a Polish fishing boat, or a ship, a factory trawler, off the coast of Washington and Oregon in the Pacific Northwest of America. But it was considered to be Polish soil because I had to go through customs after I got off the ship. So technically I was on Polish soil, even though there was no real soil because it was a ship. I mean, it was kind of a dirty ship. So maybe that's why. If it was a clean ship, maybe I wouldn't have had to go through customs. A lot of cockroaches on that ship, I got to admit. So anyways, that's it. My golly, this turned into a kind of a short one. I think it's partly not so much that there were very few questions, it's just that I was kind of more concise, I guess, in answering the questions. And it would be even shorter if I haven't started off with that self-indulgent introduction that many of you probably wish you had never heard. So if you have any questions that you think I can answer about early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, meditation, Buddhism in general, the history and evolution of Buddhism, Eastern philosophy in general, in ancient India, that kind of stuff, me personally, monasticism, Burma, any kind of questions like that you think I can answer, then go ahead and answer. And please, no more than 3 questions per episode. And be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And check out the URL links below the videos. And be happy.